For those living in the region, it must have played out like a nightmare. One of those bad dreams where you know something awful is about to happen, but you're powerless to stop it. For months now, Western and Ukrainian intelligence has been warning about a massing of Russian forces near Ukraine's northeast border, not far from the city of Kharkiv. As the troop numbers swelled to around 35,000, President Vladimir Putin began talking about the need to create a buffer region along the border with Kharkiv Oblast. Media speculated that an assault on Ukraine's second city could come at any time in May or June. In short, it was an attack foretold. A move in the Ukraine war's bloody strategy game that just about everyone saw coming. Yet that didn't make it any less horrific when it finally arrived. Last Friday, May 10th, the anticipated surge began. Reports started to filter in about fighting along the border. At first it was unclear if these were just skirmishes or the start of something bigger. Within 48 hours though, those doubts had evaporated. The second Russian invasion of Kharkiv had begun. The attack exploded along two distinct lines, one in the Lipsy district, the city's north, another toward the town of Vovchansk further east. Although initial reports were mixed, by Sunday it was looking like Ukraine was in serious trouble. As multiple villages fell to Putin's soldiers, overall commander of the armed forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrskyi, was quoted as saying, "The situation is difficult." Reports filtered in of territorial guard units abandoning prepared defensive lines. Come Monday, the picture had gotten even worse. With about 100 square kilometers of territory lost, the head of military intelligence, General Krylyo Budanov, told the New York Times that the situation is on the edge. Every hour, the situation moves toward critical. What made the nightmare so much worse was that the region had already experienced one Russian invasion before. Back in 2022, the initial Russian assault into Ukraine got close to Kharkiv's limits. For months, artillery was able to pound this city of 1.4 million before the surprise Ukrainian counteroffensive that fall drove the Kremlin's forces back over the border. The latest assault then had yet another ingredient of a bad dream: repetition. The feeling of having to relive something you've already suffered through before. Thankfully though, Monday would prove to be the darkest moment of the renewed invasion, at least for now. Amid reports of massive Russian casualties, the rapid advances of the weekend seemed to peter out. While many villages remained in the Kremlin's hands, things did at least seem to be moving towards stabilization. By Tuesday, General Krylyo Budanov was able to appear on television to note that the situation is not catastrophic and that Russia's troops had been blocked on the frontiers they had reached. US State Department Deputy Spokesman Vedant Patel, meanwhile, announced that Washington did not anticipate any major breakthroughs. At the time of writing, these assessments appear mostly correct, with the caveat that this is a fast-moving situation and things may yet change. Current chatter is about the front line stabilizing within days. While the Kremlin claimed on Tuesday to have also captured the town of Buravodka, Ukrainian Telegram channels are no longer in panic mode. Things seemed to have somewhat calmed. This seems to be backed up by the caution currently emanating from Russian mill bloggers. The Financial Times quoted one pro-war account telling its followers, quote, "Russians should not expect a quick breakthrough." As if to draw a line under the assault, Ukraine also dismissed the local commander who oversaw the initial response. In some ways, it felt as if everyone was ready to move on, but only in some ways, because while no one has to fear headlines about the imminent fall of Kharkiv, the weekend assault has still left a brutal mark on Ukraine as a whole. The first and most obvious issue is that up to 160 square kilometers of territory fell to Russian forces. While operations are underway to push them back, it's not at all certain that land can be recaptured. Worse, these rapid gains, likely the fastest by either side since 2022, weren't achieved by the Kremlin massing an unstoppable force and punching its way through. Of the 35,000 troops that gathered over the border, the New York Times reports that, quote, "only a few thousand were committed to the fight." Here's how the analytical group Front Intelligence Insight put it, quoting, "The Russian forces in the area did not form a cohesive mechanized force for a deep strike with concentrated strength. Instead, they employed multiple small-scale attacks at various border points using platoon-sized and even squad-sized units." This has raised questions about how prepared local commanders really were for the assault, questions we'll be examining in some detail later in this video. Before that, though, we want to turn our attention to what might seem like an odd question. What was the Kremlin's goal in launching this attack in the first place? The question's worth asking, because no serious analyst thinks even the full force of 35,000 men could have hoped to take Kharkiv. The city is strongly fortified, and to use a technical term, it's really bloody massive. Nor do the Russians even seem to have prioritized a deep drive into the oblast. Here's the Institute for the Study of Wars assessment on May the 13th, quoting again, Russian forces currently appear to be prioritizing the rapid establishment of a buffer zone along the international border for setting conditions for deeper penetrations into northern Kharkiv Oblast. Of course, war isn't just about taking territory, which is why most observers assume that Moscow's real aim isn't to storm Ukraine's second city, but to draw defenders away from a far more vulnerable settlement, Chasiv Yar. Located nearly 200 kilometers from Kharkiv, just to the west of Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar is one of the key strategic towns in the Donbass region, a former industrial heartland that has become Moscow's main aim in the war's current phase. Intense fighting at Chasiv Yar has been going on for weeks, with reports suggesting that Putin ordered it seized in time for the May the 9th victory celebrations in Russia. But with Ukrainian troops mounting an unexpectedly stiff resistance, the town, for now, remains in Kiev's hands. The assault toward Kharkiv could change all of that. As we've explained in previous videos, the AFU are currently low on manpower due to a new law on mobilization being delayed thanks to political shenanigans. That means that in a stark change from the first year of fighting, Moscow now has a serious manpower advantage over Ukraine. By applying troop pressure in some areas, the Kremlin can force Kiev to pull reserves from others, potentially creating openings. This is the rough view of analyst Rob Lee, who wrote on X that, quote, Russia likely seeks to draw Ukrainian reserves and units away from the Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar fronts to set conditions for a deeper advance into Donetsk Oblast. The problem remains that Ukraine does not have enough manpower/forces available. This operation likely seeks to stretch Ukraine's forces further. Austrian military analyst Franz Stefan Gady likewise echoed this view, telling the Times that drawing Ukrainian forces away from Chasiv Yar was Russia's main objective. To be clear, it's not certain at this point that the Kremlin succeeded in its goal. Reserves really were poured into Kharkiv over the weekend, but they may not have been from Chasiv Yar. Regardless, the point was to force Ukraine into making uncomfortable choices, and it's a tactic the Kremlin is likely to repeat again in the near future, probably with a similar incursion toward the city of Sumy, some 145 kilometers northwest of Kharkiv. Sooner or later, Russia is likely to succeed in its goal of making Kiev stretch its forces too thin. Still, we don't want to assume that Chasiv Yar was the sole region for the invasion of Kharkiv Oblast. As other analysts have pointed out, there are other secondary goals that the Kremlin may have in mind. A major one could plausibly be to not enter Kharkiv itself, but to bring the city within artillery range. Back in 2022, before the Ukrainian counteroffensive liberated most of the oblast, Kharkiv was in range of Russian guns, and you better believe Moscow's forces bombed the living shit out of it. Guardian journalist Luke Harding has talked about how, as a result, quote, swaths of the northeast of the city were left in ruins. You can still see the ghostly tower blocks. This broadly fits in with Russian tactics that we've seen elsewhere in the war. If a city can't be taken, then bomb it so badly that it just becomes unlivable. Unfortunately, establishing a permanent foothold in the small town of Vovchansk could allow Russia to do exactly that. Per The Guardian, if Russia secures positions in Vovchansk and Liptsy, it will have a solid platform for artillery attacks on the city of Kharkiv. However, it is worth noting that not everyone concurs that Vovchansk will be helpful in this regard. The Financial Times defense correspondent reports that Russia would have to penetrate much deeper into Ukraine's main defensive lines to put the city at risk of shelling. Finally, one other reason Moscow may have launched this major assault is to protect the Russian city of Belgorod. Situated just 70 kilometers from Kharkiv, Belgorod has been targeted by more cross-border attacks than any other Russian city. If the Kremlin secures enough territory in Kharkiv Oblast, it will put the city out of reach of Ukraine's weapons. Alright, so those are the likely reasons for the Kremlin's recent renewed push across the border. Understanding that, we can now focus on a more pressing issue. How was Russia able to achieve such a relatively high level of success, given everyone knew the assault was coming? As we mentioned earlier, the Kremlin couldn't have telegraphed its plans better if Putin had personally airdropped leaflets into Kharkiv Oblast that read, "We're about to attack you." Not only was the troop buildup visible, but the new North group of forces involved in the assault even set up their own Telegram channel to generate buzz. And yet, in the words of the BBC, Ukraine appears to have been ill-prepared despite official denials. Understanding why this was the case is vital, because it could point toward broader issues that may affect the defense of other regions. And while it's still too early to say for absolute certain what went wrong, there are certainly suggestions. The most damning of all is that there's a lack of defensive lines. This critique has been articulated by a few people, but rarely with as much vehemence as commander of a Ukrainian special reconnaissance unit, Denis Yaroslavsky. Speaking to the BBC, the commander claimed that in northern Kharkiv Oblast, quote, "There was no first line of defense. We saw it. The Russians just walked in. They just walked in without any minefields." To this, he later added, "Either it was an act of negligence or corruption. It wasn't failure. It was a betrayal." Now, this is obviously a super serious accusation, yet it may turn out to be the better outcome, since a corrupt local commander can be swiftly removed and put on trial. Far more concerning is the critique coming from other quarters that suggest defensive lines did exist, but were misused or abandoned. Here, for example, is former Ukrainian officer and founder of the Front Intelligence Insight, who posts on X under the name Tartargami. Some of these positions were abandoned, allowing Russian forces to occupy them. The issue here does not solely lie in fortifications, as the outcome in both the more fortified area near Hlybok and the less fortified area near Vovchansk appears to be the same. A former Ukrainian soldier who posts under the pseudonym Konstantin was even blunter. In Kharkiv, the key problem was still the command that failed to prepare for a well-known Russian offensive. The units were simply not prepared to fight. It's not only a fortifications issue, it's a lack of cohesiveness, poor communication, bad positioning, and poor training of the stationed units. Now, in the interests of fairness, we should give the other side to this. The side that notes the Russian gains came mostly in grey zones that weren't heavily guarded, what the New York Times describes as lightly defended and largely depopulated territory. Territory that naturally allows for faster advances. This side would also argue that Moscow's forces didn't even reach, let alone break through, Ukraine's main defensive lines. Still, when an assault everyone knew was coming manages to conquer over 100 square kilometers in a matter of days, not all problems can be just hand-waved away. And that includes problems that originate not in Kiev or in the AFU, but in the collective West. Perhaps the biggest of those problems is the lack of equipment and ammunition. While Congress finally passed the Ukraine supplemental some 3 weeks ago, it's taking a long time to get stuff to the front. Here's journalist Luke Harding again. Not much has arrived so far in significant quantities. In the east last week, the mortars, the artillery, the F-16 jets were not there. This missing equipment makes the job of pushing back Russian advances much, much harder. Britain's Royal United Services Institute think tank, or RUSI, explains it this way. There is a direct correlation between the speed of supply from Ukraine's international partners of artillery, ammunition, and air defense interceptors and the speed of deterioration at the front. Air defense interceptors are especially important here. Without them, Ukraine is unable to shoot down the Russian planes, unleashing hyper-destructive glide bombs against frontline positions, as they did in Vovchansk. The good news is that some of the promised equipment is already starting to show up on the front and should arrive in greater quantities in the coming weeks. The bad news is that it may not matter so long as Western restrictions on its usage remain in place. The ISW recently highlighted how, quote, current US policy prohibiting Ukraine from using US-provided weapons in the territory of Russia is severely compromising Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Because Washington doesn't want to see a full-blown war between Russia and NATO, the Pentagon restricts the Ukrainians from using American weaponry on Russian soil. The ISW explains what this means in practice, quoting, US policy has effectively created a vast sanctuary in which Russia has been able to amass its ground invasion force and from which it is launching glide bombs and other long-range strike systems. This isn't to say that things would be easy if the US changed its policy. The 35,000 troops near Belgorod didn't mass in a single place where some well-aimed rockets could have decimated their ranks or anything, but a green light to strike Russian rear supporting areas would certainly make Moscow's job a lot harder. The sad truth, though, is that most of these are only surface problems. The real, deeper issue that lies at the heart of Ukraine's issues in Kharkiv is one that most Western analysts, including us, have been highlighting for months now, and that's manpower. Back in autumn of 2023, former top commander in Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, asked the government to mobilize 500,000 men to replenish the AFU's ranks. Instead, the mobilization bill was delayed by political infighting that mirrored the dysfunction in the US House of Representatives over the Ukraine supplemental. Kiev only finally passed the new mobilization law at the end of April, and it only took effect this week. This means that Ukraine now needs to mobilize and train hundreds of thousands of new troops, a process likely to take a minimum of 3 months and possibly more. As a result, Ukrainian front lines are now stretched thin and manned by exhausted soldiers without the reserves for proper rotation. This is why pretty much everyone agrees that Moscow's next move after Kharkiv will almost certainly be an assault toward the city of Sumy. In General Budanov's words, "From the very beginning, the Russians were planning an operation in Sumy region. As of now, Tuesday, they are keeping small groups of forces in the border area. They have the town of Shudya, and we have the Sumy area, but the situation has not allowed them to take active action and start implementing their plan." That plan is the same one that we described earlier, stretching the AFU even thinner until a gap opens up somewhere in the front line that the Kremlin can exploit. A gap that will be helped by the thousands of Ukrainian troops currently tied up around Kharkiv. Right now, smaller groupings of Russian forces are keeping the AFU fixed at various points. Sabotage groups near Chernihiv ensure soldiers must be posted to the northern border. Attacks near Zaporizhzhia keep more pinned in the south. According to IUSI, the breadth of their attacks has fixed Ukrainian troops on the line of contact and forced the AFU to spread out its artillery, expending munitions to break up successive Russian attacks. The think tank foresees this problem growing worse in the coming weeks. Along with the current actions around Kharkiv, we're likely to see an assault towards Sumy, and likely one coming from the south that might aim for Zaporizhzhia. Also, IUSI thinks that Ukraine will be able to blunt all of these attacks. But all that will do is leave Russia able to push towards its main goal, conquering the Donbass. Here's how the think tank's analysts see Moscow's summer offensive unfolding, quoting, "Once Ukraine commits its reserves in these directions, the main effort will see the expansion of the Russian push in Donbass. This axis is already making slow but steady progress. The objective is clear: to cut Ukrainian supply lines connecting Konstantinivka and Kramatorsk. Once those supply lines are cut, holding Donetsk Oblast will become much harder. The likely scenario is a Ukrainian retreat, allowing Putin to reach the administrative borders and claim his biggest victory in 2 years. A victory that will make the Russian conquest of Bakhmut and Avdiivka seem trifling in comparison." If all of that sounds a little bit depressing, it probably should. The situation in Ukraine right now is pretty bleak, and wishful thinking isn't going to change that. However, we don't produce these videos just to depress you. We also try to analyze why things are happening in a certain way. And in doing so, we can maybe begin to see the outlines of how Kyiv can turn this around. The most important point, after throwing everything it can at mobilization, is for Kyiv not to fall prey to optimism bias. The former AFU soldier who posts on X as Constantine recently complained that, quote, "Our highest military and political leadership doesn't like negative reports, and units/commands that report problems are frowned upon. This leads to commanders unwilling to ask for help and report the real state of affairs, instead trying to blur away problems and hoping that they will never bubble up." Now, this is just one person reporting this, so it doesn't constitute proof. However, if that is indeed the case, then the Ukrainian leadership runs the risk of repeating the mistakes Russia made in 2022, when a culture of burying bad news led Moscow to wildly overestimate its chances of pulling off a quick conquest. In the West, too, our governments can take steps to ensure Ukraine survives this difficult moment with its forces mostly intact. Here's the IUSI's assessment, quoting again, "If Ukraine's allies engage now to replenish Ukrainian munition stockpiles, help to establish a robust trading pipeline, and make the industrial investments to sustain the effort, then Russia's summer offensive can be blunted and Ukraine will receive the breathing space it needs to regain the initiative." Because make no mistake, a Russian victory is not inevitable at this point. While they vastly outnumber Ukraine's forces, the troops currently fighting on Moscow's side are mostly low quality. The majority of capable junior officers and elite units were decimated in the botched invasion at the start of 2022, and Russia's theory of victory now relies on grinding slowly forward using massive artillery barrages and glide bombs to destroy everything in its path. And who knows, that may yet be enough to win the war, to make some big gains that cause Ukraine's backers to throw in the towel and force Kyiv to negotiate an unfavorable peace. But it's also a pretty primitive method of fighting, one that could be neutralized by an AFU with sufficient fortifications, munitions, and manpower. Whether the governments in Kyiv and the West are able to sort out their shit quickly enough to make this a reality, that's debatable. What's not up for debate is that this moment, right now, represents their last best shot to do so. The war is not lost yet, but unless the people in power get serious about sorting their issues out soon, we may yet find that this summer brings the worst news imaginable. News of a Russian victory that would all rather avoid.